What's up, guys? So I'm watching YouTube the other day, watching Zach in the Wild like I usually do, and I come across this clip and I almost fall out of my chair. Check it out.
If you think about a perfect triangle, that becomes rounder and rounder as it abrades away. You can also lose an edge due to chipping or to rolling. Those are other mechanisms. But if you've got the appropriate geometry for the type of cutting that you're doing, you really should be losing your edge to wear. If you're losing your edge to chipping or rolling, you need to go more obtuse on your angle.
Right, and this is a huge consideration, not just considering steels, right, you're using, but the way that an edge is finished and the grind that's on a knife are like really important to the performance of particular steels in particular situations too, right?
So edge geometry is actually more important than steel, and it's more important than heat treating. Edge geometry is actually more important than steel, and it's more important than heat treating. So if you want to increase the performance of your knife, just sharpen it differently.
Cool.
So take it to a more acute angle and just start cutting stuff.
Yeah.
And then if you get a roll or a chip the way that you're using this knife, then back off a little bit. A lot of knife enthusiasts don't understand the ability that they have to improve the performance of their own knife. I work all day, every day at optimizing steel choice and heat treatment, and I will admit the edge geometry matters than both of those things.
I love it.
All right, so a little context here. The guy that Zach is talking to in that video is Dr. Laren Thomas. He is the authority when it comes to knife steels. He's created his own knife steel at this point called MagnaCut. It's probably the hottest thing on the market. And when it comes to understanding knife steel, he's pretty much written the book on it, literally. He's got a website called Knife Steel Nerds you can go to learn more about how all the steels work and perform. But when I saw this from Dr. Thomas, I ran around the office telling everyone about, guys, look, Dr. Thomas is saying that the steel doesn't matter as much as edge geometry. How cool is that? And so I wanted to bring a couple guys on to discuss that subject itself. I've got Dan here, who is probably the most foremost expert in the room when it comes to how to sharpen a knife. And then obviously you guys know Josh, who's sharpened tons of knives, started the workshop. Couldn't think of two better guys to sit down and talk about this subject with. Thanks for joining me, guys.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah.
Happy to have Dan here too.
Yeah, Dan's new on the channel. If you guys haven't seen him before, he's been around. You've probably seen him in some of our content, but this is really the first time we've sat down with Dan. So I want to introduce Dan a little bit too. You've probably seen him in Zach's video where he's the mad scientist of sharpening. But man, Dan, you've been around for a long time. Man, you're a resident knife nerd. You designed the KTS that put us on the map. Your fingerprints on just about every knife sharpener we've made. And you're pretty darn familiar with Laren's work too. But what I leave out, introduce yourself to the audience and yeah.
Been a knife guy my whole life. I've been sharpening for 40 some years since I was a little kid. It's literally in my blood. It happens when you cut yourself. So, but read both of Laren's books, researched knife steels for years. I'm by no means a knife steel expert. I've got a decent background in engineering, but these guys are way beyond my knowledge and understanding. But I know edges. I've anecdotally have sharpened thousands and thousands of knives and thousands of steels over the years, and there's no bad steel.
Okay.
It's application specific, just like Laren said in the video.
Yep. So the first question I have for you, Dan, is if we're trying to find a balance between heat treat and the type of steel and then edge geometry, how do we get the right edge geometry on a knife? How do we make sure that we're putting the right edge geometry on for that specific steel and that heat treat? It's kind of a tough question to answer, I think.
I look at it from mostly application specific. So what are you doing with that knife? The edge geometry for a kitchen knife that's going to do nothing but touch, raw proteins is a different edge than I put on even a kitchen knife that's going to go cut root vegetables. Okay. Right. There's different advantages you can run, and it's based on the steel's capability too. My technique for when I get into a new steel, when I'm learning a new steel, I do exactly what Thomas said in the video. You basically start at the lowest angle you think you can run. Run the knife through your application. If you see chipping and rolling, increase the angle until you basically can survive. Because he's right, you want to basically get to a point where is your mode of failure. Okay. You don't want chipping and rolling to be your primary mode of failure.
So go as steep as you can as far as the angle goes. Whether that's 15 or 20 degrees, use the knife. If you're seeing chipping, if you're seeing rolling, go more obtuse.
Yep.
Okay. and that'll get you more performance out of that particular steel.
In that particular, in that application.
Right, that's not going to work from knife to knife.
The caveats is those aren't the only factors.
Okay.
Is that you also have the type of edge, and this is a big one that people don't realize. You can adjust the performance of your knife. We know this from serrated blades, right? A serrated blade performs drastically different, or a saw. Those all do different. There's different types of cutting. And so the type of edge you run also has a huge difference, not just the angle. And so if you're changing the type of edge, you may find you also need to change the angle to compensate for the type of edge you produce.
Gotcha.
Does edge thickness, or like spine thickness of a knife, or the thickness, probably the thickness behind the edge as you've come down the primary grind, does that play a big factor to you, do you think, in achieving the optimal angle?
Yeah, that's a huge factor. If you get into a knife that's meant to do hard work, you'll feel that this, even though this is ground relatively thin for a hard use knife, you can feel the cutting edge behind this. So the thickness behind the edge on this knife is way thicker than it would be for, say, something and doing a much more delicate task. You want essentially and it is dependent on the steel. So you're going to want a blade thickness or a primary grind thickness that matches the performance of the steel and the application you run. And most of us that are, using our knives, we have the ability to modify the edge type and the edge angle. Within reason, we're not going to modify the primaries. We're not going to be able to really thin the knife out. That's going to be based on the knife we bought, and we definitely aren't going to modify the steel unless we're really mad scientists, right?
Yeah.
Right.
When you say that,
we have two really big triggers to go optimize what we have to work with.
when you talk about edge type, you're talking about either flat or convex or more hollow, or
flat, convex, hollow. Those grind types, those geometries matter a bit depending on the application. The biggest one that has an effect on cutting performance, just how sharp it feels and how well it cuts, is the type of edge, how toothy the edge is, right? So how close do you get to serrated blade when you grind it, or how close do you get to, something with push cut like a razor? So there's a huge difference in performance in those depending on what you're cutting. If you took a shaving edge and go and try and cut a tree down, you're not going to get anywhere. One, it's not going to hold that edge very long, and two, it won't be able to cut those toughened fibers very well, right? Where you put a little bit of tooth in it, and you can take these knives and eventually get a tree down if you're patient enough. It's not more important than steel, but they all go together to create the recipe. And because edge type and edge angle is actually really easy to modify, it's the one you can change a knife, and I frequently adjust my knife for the task I'm doing. Because it might take a couple of minutes at the most for me to go change the angle, or especially to change the edge type to add more tooth into a blade. I can do that in a couple of minutes pretty quickly and make that knife perform that task. If I'm going to spend a half an hour cutting something, I'm going to adjust the knife to that task rather than fight through with an inferior edge.
Yeah, because it doesn't take much to add some teeth to an edge. It doesn't take much to make an edge a little more obtuse. I mean, it's pretty simple to make those modifications. Which is a little bit of education on how to sharpen a knife, really. One question that popped into my brain while I was watching that video was, if that is such a consideration when it comes to a knife, how much emphasis do you think manufacturers put on what kind of edge they're putting on knife to knife to knife?
or like how often do they get it right?
Yeah, like are they really caring that much? I mean, we've talked about this before on the workshop, is that a lot of knives from the factory are sharpened by hand, and so from one guy to the next you can get a little bit different angle on what that knife comes out as. So I find myself wondering, like, if those are the three things that really impact how a knife performs, I'm not trying to throw manufacturers under the bus, but it's a fair question to ask, are they putting enough emphasis on it?
What I can say, you know, anecdotal evidence, but I've got a lot of evidence over the years, is that the knife manufacturers are getting way better. I mean, they're basically targeting lower angles, which makes it a lot easier for us to basically go optimize it. When you put a big, fat, huge angle on this knife, it takes us a lot of time to thin that out if that's going to be the optimal thing. So most manufacturers are going to much lower angles and, you know, included angle.
I've seen that industry trend, especially as it comes to like hunting knives. You're seeing them get a lot steeper, more slicey. Kitchen knives especially, it seems like everyone's going to like a 15-degree angle on their kitchen knives anymore and getting more thin and slicey. Not to say that's, you know, universal, but it's just a trend I'm seeing a lot of, and it probably has a lot to do with kind of what you're saying. Is like you can get more out of a knife if you can get as steep of angle as you can, considering the steel, finding that balance point or that tipping point.
And the advertised angle isn't always accurate.
Sure, you
but
know that.
you know, when I err towards the lower angle because it is very easy to basically, especially if you're going to produce a micro bevel, it's very easy to increase the angle. If you see chipping or rolling, that's the easiest mode, is start low and basically increase the angle as you need to.
Okay.
So I err towards thinner blades and thinner grinds or lower angles out of the box.
Yeah.
And then I also choose steels that respond to those very well.
Yeah.
Because I know the highest performance you're going to get is, you know, in the real world, in a dream world, a knife would be infinitely thin, right? The angle would be infinitely small, and you'd cut everything just by looking at it. You know, you could wave it through the air and cut atoms.
Right.
You know, physics says we can't do that, but you know, so start with as close to the ideal world as you can when you purchase the knife, and then tune it as you need, you know, as you find for your application.
Sure.
But,
yeah, that's where steel comes in. Not that steel is not important in any of this, but you know, if you take a softer steel, you know, a stainless that would have been a 13 MOV type of steel, and you sharpen that to a 15-degree angle, and most likely the mode of failure is going to be that steel is going to roll. And so that's why when you get into something like, okay, now you can get into a Magna Cut or a M390 and you can go to a thinner angle and you're less likely to roll. Maybe more likely to chip.
More likely to chip. So that's the trade-off you have in steel, is you're basically making a judgment on the thinnest angle you can run. Are you going to err on the rolling side, or are you going to err on the chipping side? What's going to be your mode of failure? You know, obviously most of the higher edge retention steels, their tendency is going to be to chip, right? And same thing with just heat treats. If you crank the heat treat up and get this thing as hard as you can. Now finer grains, you know, powder metallurgy is doing wonderful things to the knife world. Never been a D2 fan, but PM has fixed D2.
Okay.
It's turned it into a phenomenal steel. It's on par with other high-end steels today just by powdering the same steel that was a large grain, kind of chunky. It's great for wear items, but it's just never a great knife edge. And so there's a lot you can do, you know, in processing the steel. It's not just the chemistry of the steel. Manufacturers sometimes have to choose, you know, they're making decisions on the knife. What's the best, you know, for the application, but also we've got to make this knife affordable for the market they're targeting after. And steels also some steels can be really hard to process, you know, for them to produce the grind, the finish, the geometry they want. So some manufacturers, I'm sure, were avoiding steels that might be best for the application in the finish grind because they can't make the knife to their standard.
Yeah, I think Laren even mentions further in this video, and if you guys want to check out the video, it's on Zach and the Wild's channel. But he even mentions that there's some steels that manufacturers will get through and they get to the heat treat and they're like, man, I'm just having a hard time finishing this knife because this steel's just so unruly. And he's just like, yeah, I'm sorry, hands up in the air. And it is what it is with some of these steels. It's interesting. Now you've done a little research for us on this, and you're actually using a lot of from Laren's website, knifesteelnerds.com. You've done some research to like show us how much edge retention impacts how long an edge will hold up versus the steel too. You've got some graphs for that.
So this is, if you looked at, you went to a carpenter, or, a standard knife steel manufacturer site, you're going to see a list of steels. This is a cartoon unitless graph, but you're seeing basically steels, along the bottom and the edge retention. If we go to the next graph, you'll see, this is my rendition of this. This is more important is where you're using it. So there's different types of sharp, right? We talked about plunge cutting or shaving. That's a different type of sharp than what you'd use on I would say on an EDC or most tasks. And then there's applications where you really want to saw or smash through, where that super fine edge doesn't actually work better. It performs better with either toothy or with a blunt edge.
Can actually outperform like that. You want some toothy.
If you're chopping, for instance, a super fine edge, a highly refined, highly narrow edge is not going to survive. I don't care what steel you run, it's not going to survive the load. And so you have to make choices based on the application you're running. You can, it's like a 4D matrix. I'm only showing 3D here, but
sure,
inside of kitchen, there's also multiple applications inside of kitchen. If you're cutting nothing but raw proteins, you're going to run it. The ideal edge is a different edge than if you're busting through winter squash, that type of thing.
Which is why there's so many kitchen knives available. They're trying to compensate for that a little bit too.
In testing, what we're looking at is basically look at the force required to cut. That you can. On the bottom graph, that's kind of what you think from that previous chart. and then sharpness. So as you increase sharpness, the force required to cut, the solid line goes down, right?
Yeah.
So as the sharpest thing is the lowest force, the dullest or the bluntest angle is going to require the highest force. And its edge and blade thickness is the inverse of that, essentially. As you increase edge angle or blade thickness, we talked about that primary grind. As a blade gets thicker, it requires more force to basically penetrate through what you're cutting. This doesn't work for a lot of the sharpness testers that people do out there. They shave or they cut. There's a little sharpness tester, we use it here, where you're cutting basically fishing line with it, right? The edge angle, and you'll find in that test, the edge angle and the blade thickness actually doesn't make much of a difference, because you're cutting one single little tiny fiber. That's usually not where we're cutting. We're usually cutting a bundle of fibers. You know, if you're cutting rope or other materials, if it's meat, whatever it is, it's a bundle of fibers. And so when you get thicker, now you've got to push those fibers out of the way, and that's where a thicker blade increases the force required to cut.
More force.
You know,
makes sense.
Typical. This is a real cartoon look at what Laren would do in his work. But there's basically edge retention, and there's a group of steels. As you increase the carbide content or the alloy content or the type of carbides, you increase the edge retention. And in his books, he basically has shown and proven that you can predict the edge life. So you can engineer edge life. It's not a black art. You can look at the type of carbide, the concentration of the carbide, the size of the carbides in the distribution, combine that with the other geometries we've talked about, and predict what the edge life will be. It's a science. It's not a black magic, and he knows how to do all that in the steel composition. We know how to do that on the back end. Once it's already made, we know how to optimize that too.
Sure.
But that's what you normally see, is basically as you increase the alloys, carbides, hardness, you can drop, take any, in most cases, the cost of the steel. As you increase all that, the edge retention goes up. The drawback to it is that as the edge retention goes up, on the next slide you'll see, oh, okay, so sorry, this is right from Laren's website. You'll see the same graph in his books, but this basically plots those steels. I changed he has a different graph than I do, but what he's showing here is basically as edge retention goes up, there's a drawback typically in steels, is toughness goes down. So now we have toughness on the vertical scale and edge retention on the horizontal scale. And you'll see, take a steel like Maximat X21 15D, all these super high edge retention steels, they're very low in toughness, right? So
meaning they will chip or...
Correct.
Yeah. And
so to compensate for that, if we have a Rex 121 blade, we're going to use this thing in anything but a delicate operation.
Right.
We got to make it thick to survive, otherwise it's going to chip and blow out, right? Whereas we can run something on the other end of that, pick 3V, Crewware, any of those steels that are on the tough end of that, we can run those at a way lower angle, potentially, and a way thinner grind than you can run a Maximat or a Rex 121 at the same application.
Interesting.
And so this is where I highly lean. My personal preference, my steels, what I run every day, they're on the left side of this curve.
Toughness.
Because I can make these things thinner in my type of usage and the applications I run. I can make this steel thinner and still survive.
The edge will last
and won't chip. And if my mode of failure is rolling, I would choose rolling over chipping any day.
It's an easy thing to fix.
Correct. And so when you go back in that graph, so that solid line is the one we talked about earlier. That's kind of the cartoon version. Increase the alloys, basically the edge retention goes up. The dotted line is you increase the alloys, the toughness or resistance to chipping goes up, and then it drops.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can basically the edge retention due to damage instead of edge retention due to wear. Once you cross over this kind of midpoint of these steels, once you get up into these super or very high alloyed steels, you start running risk that you're going to have chipping and other things, especially when you push those to really high hardness. And so there's a give and take from going there. I don't recommend taking a lot of knives to there. You'll get better performance from a less alloyed steel than you will from in a lot of applications. Matter of fact, most applications.
Yeah, you've challenged me to this one before. I like it. You said you take the more premium hard steel and I'll take the softer steel, and we'll put two different angles on them and I'll outcut you. I'd love to put that to the test someday. But that's kind of what you're talking about here, right? Like,
and as a sharpening guy who makes a living on sharpening, right? Both in products and it's my passion. It's a hobby for me, right? And so as a sharpening guy, I'll take that challenge on any day if we're going to run indefinitely, because I'm going to be able to resharpen a tougher, decent edge retention steel and get it back to work much faster than you're going to be able to take a 15B or Maximin or one of these things and get an acceptable edge back on. So I'll be sharpening more often. I'll fully admit that.
Right.
But I'll resharpen in 30 seconds. I'll be able to hone or strop my blade back in. If you take Rex 21 and go to it, loses its edge, you're going to be there a while, even on power sharpening. You know. And so it's the life cycle that I look at the product. You know, it's not perfect for every application. Machine knives, things where it's very expensive to actually do sharpening, you have to disrupt a manufacturing process. Go all the way for edge retention. If you've got an application, you know, it could be something in military. It could be some other cases where sharpening is not an option. You have, you know, edge life can mean the difference between life and death. Pay for the best you can get. You know, otherwise you'll probably get better performance by, you know, investing in sharpening instead of, you know, obviously I'm biased, we sell sharpeners, but you'll get better performance over life by working on the sharpening solution than you will, you know, chasing down that forever super steel. And so this is the way to look at that. Again, edge retention. Now we're looking at edge angle. So remember we had alloy on the bottom, so the steel alloy or carbide content. Now we put edge angle on it and the curve inverts. So basically as you increase the edge angle, you reduce the edge retention. And that's what Darren talked about. So, so if you basically take a knife, you've got basically an angle like this. If you got a really blunt angle, as you wear that down, it gets fat really quick. And it's the width of that edge that dictates whether or not it's sharp or not. The narrower knife basically will stay sharp longer. You can consume more cutting edge before it gets too thick to actually function.
As it abrades, there's still a thinner edge behind it where it'll cut better for longer. That makes sense.
And just like you do with alloys, guess what? There's a trade-off. As you go to very low angles, so now you look at the edge retention, or, you know, due to damage. So you'll have much higher edge retention from damage. In other words, you'll resist chipping and rolling when you got big fat angles. When you're in those really narrow angles, now you've got a problem. You can actually roll sooner. So you've got to know the load you're applying and then pick, you know, ideally pick that area. If you understand your applications really well, I just know based on steels what angle to grind these things at. You know, but the best way to figure it out is just like Laren said, you're going to start at the lowest angle you feasibly can pull off and keep, you know, and use the knife in your application. If it rolls or chips, increase it.
And that's subject to each person too. So when you say your application, how are you using the knife? Get as steep as you can, use it the way you use it. If you're seeing it's not performing, go a little more obtuse, go wider on that angle to get the most out of that alloy. Makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me, and I like the solution that, well, and we said this, but the power that puts in every knife owner's hands of like, oh, this is, you know, I get to choose what I want for my knife and the way that I use this knife, because the way that I use a knife is going to be different than the way that you use the same exact knife, and I can make it work for me.
Yeah, and it's not like one is more important than the other. They're important together. Essentially, you're working with the blade steel, so clearly the blade steel is really important to the performance. But you can use edge angle to take a blade steel and turn it from good at this application to this application. You can take edge type and do the same thing. You know, and so there's a lot of opportunity you have after the knife is made to optimize the knife. And like I say, once you get good at it, it's easy enough to do. I do it per task. I don't do it if I'm going to make one cut, but if I'm going to go, you know, break down a whole primal cut, whatever, I'm going to actually adjust my knife edge to basically that cut. I'm not going to fight through with the wrong edge.
Yeah, I did it the other day, cutting through some irrigation line, and I want a more toothy edge on a short bladed, hard-working pocket knife, and I go put a toothy edge on it.
Yeah, it seems like, from my experience in dealing with the commons, everyone always seems to want to chase that super polished, slicey edge.
Well, that's bragging rights.
Right. But when it comes to actually using it, it's not always the best. Sometimes the toothy edge does serve better.
The edge that cuts that
twine,
little piece of filament, you know, that cuts that the best isn't necessarily the best edge. That you wouldn't use that to go cut down a tree. That's just, you know, that's not going to perform well. And we use our knives for a lot of different things. So it really depends. If it's your EDC, adjust it to what you do every day. If you're cutting cardboard boxes, there's so much dirt and crap inside a cardboard. I don't recommend actually using that highly refined edge. It just won't hold up that well. Even if you have the super steel, try that toothy edge. I think over time you'll see much better performance. You know, at least I do.
Yeah. Yeah. Real quick on like how to make a toothy edge on a manual sharpener. What's your recommendation?
So the easiest way is when you finish, only finish on one side. So if you were to sharpen this knife and you want to put a, you know, this is a big thick knife, I want to put a really toothy edge on, I'll go the toothiest grit that I have, right? And you basically cut that and you heal that, you'll cut that into it. So work both edges down and you get like that one stroke, and I got a nice big burr on that thing. And so the easiest way to do it, skip everything. Don't go to the fine diamond, don't go to the ceramic, go straight to the leather and only do the backside. So I did one stroke here, hear that gravel, big old burr on this side. Now I'll go to leather and go to the opposite side. And basically just
Removing the burr.
Just remove that burr. If you work both sides too much, you can actually remove all that tooth you just made.
Yeah.
But you know, that burr's gone just in what I just did. And now there's enough tooth. This is actually grabbing my fingernail. This knife was shaving sharp before, and I can actually, as I pull on it, it's literally pulling my thumb. So that's how quick you can convert the edge. I didn't change. I didn't do an angle change there. I just converted the edge, and that the performance of this knife just drastically changed from what 10 seconds to 15 seconds of work. You know.
And that's what you're talking about when you say you can use whatever steel you want.
Correct.
I can get more performance just by changing how I sharpen the knife.
Correct. Without even changing the angle. So edge type matters as much in some cases as edge angle and as much as blade steel.
Well, obviously this is a lot of information to take in, but there are a few key takeaways I think we can come away from this with. And if we left anything out, guys, make sure you leave comments down below. But Dan, what are the key takeaways you want the viewers to walk away with after watching this?
So there's really 4 key factors to your edge performance, right? Blade steel, the blade geometry on the knife is ground, the edge angle, and the edge type. You as a knife owner, knife user, you have full control over 2 of those.
Yeah.
These 2 you control when you purchase or make the knife. These 2 you control when you sharpen a knife.
Right.
So we have a lot of influence in how our knives perform, and it's easy to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Just get in there, start sharpening your knives, own your experience with the knife itself, and like play with it. Whatever steel you got, mess around. Don't be afraid to sharpen your knives, use your stuff, and change it to what you want. Thanks for watching, guys. Like I said before, if we left anything out, leave a comment down below. If you want to learn more about some of this stuff, have Dan come on, pick his brain, put some of this stuff to the test. Maybe we need to have that showdown where I take my super steel and you take your whatever steel you want.
Bring it on.
And we put it to the test. Right on. Thanks for watching, guys.